Okay, good afternoon. We've had a few issues with uploading videos, so I did a club history video on Eintracht Frankfurt, and it's got stuck, so I've had to basically scrap that. And so we're doing a Q&A session, basically an unplanned one because for some reason my video upload wouldn't upload. So what's been going on? Well, European football has obviously got a problem, and I'm interested to see what your questions are on European football because it seems that the TV deals are in crisis, and it seems as if the clubs and players are going to have some lengthy discussions going forward about what's going to happen. Yes, now I'm going to use the whiteboard for this because we're going to have a lot of questions. So the Premier League looks likely to return training sometime, sometime in May and behind closed doors. So no fans. That's basically what's going to happen. There's going to be no fans in attendance. It's going to hurt some clubs more than others. It's a known problem that's going to be there. So Premier League, yeah, behind closed doors. I'm going to use a different pen now. We use purple. So yeah, Premier League. It looks like behind closed doors. When it comes to will it be pushed back a month? I don't know. The transfer market is something we can discuss. The transfer market is at the moment obviously not open. But the big issue with the transfer, I'm just going to shut my curtains. I'll be back in a sec. Oh god, there's not enough room in here. I'm just trying to be very vital for legal paperwork, but that's it. Oh, I've got a carpet. I can back off. So yes, so the Premier League and other leagues looking like behind closed doors. I'm going to put May or June / June. That's the most likely we're going to have any kind of football is at some point early midsummer. The Newcastle United takeover. Well, we know that. Who's this colour? Newcastle United. Oh God, that is the worst writing I've ever done. Newcastle United. On the Newcastle United front, Newcastle takeover could be completed mid-May. I think that's the earliest any takeover will be completed with Newcastle will be mid-May. What we've heard is that Amanda Stabley and the other investors have put their application with the Premier League, and normally it takes 2 to 4 weeks for that application to be reviewed. So we're looking at mid-May at the earliest for any possible takeover with the league and anything on those lines. We're also we're also looking at a mid-May takeover at the earliest. It could be longer with what's going on with the league at the moment. So watch that space. It's going to be interesting to see, what actually happens. But yeah, as I'm saying, mid-May at the earliest, and May June also with the earliest with the Premier League. On this point, they are sending out documents to teams to start getting their teams players into pre-season style training. But yeah, looking like very much behind closed doors. The Venkies with Blackburn, that's a long story of woe. That goes back over a decade. We've seen no hint that they want to sell. They've started to make more money on the club. The club is starting to stabilise, but we had some horrific losses, and technically we're in breach of financial fair play. And that in itself is an issue with the Newcastle United owners. Oh god, I'm going to use black for this. Yes, so 80% is the Saudi public investment fund, the PIF. Now that has links to the Saudi government and some big Saudi companies, mostly deal with oil and gas. And 80% of the takeover bid is from Saudi Arabia. Yes, there are question marks over the human rights, and you can debate, should they be allowed to purchase the club with their questionable human rights record in Saudi Arabia? It's not the Saudi government that's technically buying the club. It's the money's coming from their investment fund. They want to branch out and diversify their economy just for more than oil and gas. So they're pumping money into other investments, other businesses, in order to grow the Saudi economy away from the oil and gas. Questionable about the human rights record, but Saudi Arabia is going through this political reform, and that's a separate issue as well. But anything's better than Mike Ashley, because Amanda Stabley and the other investors, there's a couple of other investors as well who own about 10 or 15%. She owns 10% of the of bid. A couple of other investment bankers own another 10%, and then the 8% is the Saudi. It seems that whatever happens, investment's going to come into Newcastle United. Whether it be, then we have to mention this financial fair play. Financial fair play, it's going to be very, very interesting. Will that breach financial fair play with the takeover, and how much they're willing to invest in the club? That's something that, again, needs to be taken into consideration. Absolutely. It's an interesting point. It should not be disregarded at all. I think we have to, bear that in mind with the proposed takeover, but we're looking at a mid-May at the earliest for any decision from the Premier League and the FA whether the takeover can go through. But I think Mike Ashley, he's dropped his asking price by 50 million, and we'll see what happens. But we do know that Peter Kenyon had a couple of bids. We know Amanda Davis is her third attempt to buy the club. We know that's Bin Khalid, whatever his name is, Sheikh Khalid, cousin of the guy who owns Manchester City, wanted to take over the club. So there's a lot going on, but we know that when her first bid failed and when Peter Kenyon's bid failed, his initial bid, there were several bids on the table. Mike Ashley's dropped his asking price by 50 million, and that is interesting. This crisis has forced his hand. He was asking too much money in the first place, but now he actually needs the money to prop up the rest of his business empire, which is starting to crumble. The Saudis are rich because they don't pay tax. Tax avoidance. It's going to be interesting to see what happens out of this. But one thing that is regularly overlooked and dates back to before the club was for sale is the French tax fraud investigation. Now, the reporting has gone very, very quiet in recent months. But this time, 3 years ago, that was really important, because what it related to was the Jemba Bar transfer and several other player transfers across Europe emanating from France over the previous decade or so. It involved money laundering, agents not declaring earnings, a whole host of backhand deals. That is still actually going. It also involves Chelsea and West Ham as well. So that is really interesting that is still on the table. And the fact that the media aren't really reporting that is really interesting. Reporting on that has gone very, very quiet the last year or so. But the investigation is still open, but it's the French legal system, so that is notoriously known as a very slow process. It will be interesting to see what then comes of that. And it will also be interesting to see, my magnet doesn't work. And it'll be interesting to see, what further comes from it, if anything. But it is an interesting point that is still an active investigation to do with the French authorities that also involves the British authorities and clubs across Europe. It's not just a French thing. It relates to organised crime and all sorts of undeclared payments with player agents. And this is where agents, this is something that has been going on for a while, is agents and big word, transparency. A lot of the problem that we're finding with the European transfer market is that agents take their fees. And every transfer, there's agents' fees in there. And the lack of transparency about where that money goes is why so many clubs right now are panicking about transfer payments they still owe to other clubs. And football has a big problem, real big problem. One word. And it's a big word. Everyone thinks football's awash with cash. It is. It's someone else's money. There's a lot of debt in football. Massive amounts. Massive amounts of debt. The Man City situation is interesting because they were banned for 2 years pending an appeal. Now, we know that AC Milan had their European ban reduced. And we know that Paris Saint-Germain, PSG had their ban more like a heavy fine, although they're still under investigation. The issue that we have, and it is a big issue, the Man City situation is such. Let's get the blue pen out because that's darker. So we've got Man City, okay, and we have financial fair play. So that they breached that. Okay, we know they breached financial fair play. The interesting point is this: UEFA come along. They admit that this doesn't work, but they also punish these guys for breaching that. This leads to 2-year ban Euro football. Now, we know that another big European club, and we're going to use these guys as the example because AC Milan also breached that. They also received that. It is interesting. And what makes this whole situation very interesting is these guys, under Alexander Serafin, have admitted in his first weeks in charge, he admitted financial fair play doesn't work. Now, what does Man City do? Because we don't know if European football, club football like Champions League and Europa League is going to take place next season. Their goal is to finish it in, let's find a pen, they want to finish it August. Now, the Champions League is doable. Okay, we can tick that off. Europa League, big question mark. So the whole thing then causes other issues. So let's find a pen. So with that in mind, it links into transfers and next season. And look at how crazy the board's getting already. We're linking everything back into that. And then that, August, it causes transfer problems. And then that goes back to UEFA because they've said they want to complete everything by, a certain date. How much money do I think UEFA have lost? God, because games haven't taken place and we're only going by predicted earnings because it depends who gets through to, let's say, for example, an outsider club gets through. Now, we know there's a team that's a big underdog, and it's a team that I support in Italy, Atalanta. They are probably the underdog. They have really set Champions League alight this season, their first Champions League season. First team to qualify for the knockout, the quarterfinal stages. Atletico obviously have beaten Liverpool as well. Now, if let's say Atalanta were to win the final, UEFA make less money. They want one of the bigger clubs to win so they can sell tickets. Problem is, Atalanta have really shown that they belong at this level. But then that goes back into this, August. The seasons start then. Transfer market is going to be open in August. Goes back on UEFA, and then the financial fair play rules, could they be relaxed? Could Man City, AC Milan, all these other clubs that have issues with that, could they then appeal bans and recoup losses? The amount of money that UEFA has lost, we could be looking at billions, absolute billions. It's bananas how much money is on the line here. And if we circle back, oh God, if we circle back, hit the wafer up again. So you've got UEFA, okay, and you have then. Now let's do this. Domestic FAs, domestic association, right? They have told these guys they want to complete their seasons. Priority. Then this, the CL/Europa League, they want to do, as I say, August. Now the Champions League is doable. They can do that in 3 weeks. Europa League, there's more games. It's going to be a logistical nightmare. Their best bet is to avoid it. But then you have clubs, as I say, like Atalanta and Atletico, who are the only teams through to the quarterfinals. Do they just play out a final then? As they're the only teams to have made it to that stage, do they just play a final then? If they cannot get all this done in August, that will cost them money. Oh, I couldn't give a toss about Sky and BT, to be brutally honest. I think they've held football to ransom. They've, you know, we can circle back to, FFP and then TV rights are part of the problem. The amount of money that TV companies are paying for rights have led to other clubs who are not as necessarily as historical, those who want to earn the big money by getting the Champions League and Europa League, for example, overspending. And this is where financial fair play doesn't work, because the system is no longer reliant on fans going on the day, buying tickets or pre-booking tickets. It is now heavily reliant on the TV rights. If no game's being played, they're demanding their money back. Clubs are having to dip in to the owners' pockets, which means financial fair play will not work at all. UEFA are panicking because they want to get the domestic FAs to complete their seasons, but they also want to complete this in like a mini tournament. If they can't complete this, the Europa League, it then throws everything out of kilter, because then the transfer market, transfers, players off contract, the whole thing becomes a shambles very quickly. And this is why I think football is going to have to change how it's run long term, because the current model only works. It doesn't really work properly at all. The current model is flawed, and financial fair play doesn't work. It's designed to keep the smaller clubs down and prevent them from ever reaching the top level. And the clubs who are at the top level, it's designed to prevent them falling down to the second tier. It's flawed. It's a flawed system. So you're going to need, out of this, you're going to see demands for salary cap. Other leagues do it very successfully, having a salary cap. There's going to be calls for that. There's going to be less money transfers. Less money in transfer market. The transfer market will go back to where it should be, normal, sustainable levels. It's been unsustainable for so long. The TV rights, fans are not happy because they're paying subscriptions, a lot of them, to Sky, BT, and then you look across Europe and you have the other various TV packages. Could we see more free-to-air TV? Could that be an outcome? Is there's less TV money? You say it's very capitalist. It is and it isn't. It's more club-based. It's more community-based. Whereas in North America, it's franchise. The owners can move where they can make money. But ironically, it's more socialist. But we're going to see a debate about the TV rights and more free-to-air access or cheaper. Because fans are already unhappy with the fact that TV timings are affecting kickoff times. The TV companies are forcing the issue when it comes to kickoff time. A salary cap is definitely going to have to be thought about. And there's less money on transfers. Absolutely. Clubs are losing money. And this is highlighting how badly governed the sport has been for 20, 30 years. We're going to see more homegrown talent. More homegrown talent is definitely going to come through leagues now. I think we've reached a point where the TV rights have been getting bigger and bigger, yet the fans have been priced out. So ticket prices as well. This is something that UEFA were heavily criticised about last year with both European final ticket price. Ticket price is something else that's definitely going to be on the agenda. Look at these issues. Salary cap, that's been called for quite some time. Excessive wages of the players, while they're right to demand wage deferrals there rather than wage cuts, they haven't helped themselves by their exorbitant wage demands. Less money for transfers. Clubs are trying to save as much money as possible, and this links in. You're going to see that linked. TV rights, more free to air. That's another debating point. The fans are not happy with the way that they're paying more and more, yet the ticket price, which links into here as well, ticket prices keep going through the roof. UEFA have faced a lot of criticism for how they handled both European finals last season, especially in Baku, where tickets were going for nearly 10 grand. That's like, for some people, half a year's wages on a single ticket. At which point you have to think that is unsustainable. That's unsustainable. People are just not willing to spend the money, and out of this crisis, people are going to have less money to spend. Less money. Football has got too big. This is the bubble bursting. It took this shutdown rather than it just imploding on itself for this to happen. But this whole thing is all linked, and then you got to think of the debt in football. This is an issue that's going really underreported. Is the amount of debt that is actually in the sport. It's unsustainable long term, and it all links in together. All of these issues link in together. And free-to-air coverage is brilliant because viewership goes up, involvement goes up, more fans go to grounds, it goes up. Take that away, and what we have seen is massive problems. I think ice hockey will be, in Europe at least, probably one of the first sports to return because of when its season starts. And all the European leagues agreed we're not going to have any playoffs, we're going to end the seasons early. Yes, we're going to take a slight financial hit, but we earn less money anyway. So I think ice hockey will probably be the first sport to return and have a full season and just get on with it. Maybe the season structure might be slightly different, but I think ice hockey would just adapt. I think it's probably going to be most likely the first sport to return. But football, rugby union, rugby league, motorsport's been hammered right now, massively hammered. Athletics, every sport is really feeling the heat. And there's contingency plans being put in by a variety of sports just to get tournaments and things put on TV. But the TV rights debate is not going anywhere anytime soon. We are seeing big debates about the structures and integrity of sport and governance. Yeah, football, you could say, has been a victim of its own success. I think the problem is the average fan has been not thought of in this whole process. And you have to look at the change, right? There is a change, definite change in football. And it comes in this decade, the 90s. That's where football really, really changed. And, you look at the record transfers then to the record transfers now, it's a completely different landscape. The transfer record's been broken, I think, 15 times in 5-10 years. Club transfer records are getting broken regularly. This is the changing point. And by the 2000s, I think that's where it was at its most successful. By the time we get here, ticket prices are out of control. We've had recession here. We had a recession in here. We had a bigger one here. This was the big one. The global financial crisis in this period. Okay. How football has gone to this point. The recession here wasn't that bad. Countries got through it. The recession here, however, is still being felt now. Yet football wages have gone up. Transfer record here. Neymar. That transfer record, that will never be broken. That will never, ever, ever, ever be broken. This transfer record here in 2017. That transfer never will be broken. Not even close. I cannot see how anyone can justify spending £250 million with add-ons and bonuses on a player transfer. I cannot see it. I cannot see it being sustainable. And we'll see. Does ice hockey deserve a national arena? No nation really has a national arena per se. When they host internationals, they take them on tour. You notice with the World Championships, it's normally held in a couple of cities. I think it's a weird. It's a weird one. And you're going to get deleted, you little dirty little. It's another one removed. No, I don't. Ice hockey's never had a national arena as such. It's an interesting one. A lot of internationals have been played around the country in the UK, but there's no national arena really. You look at Canada and the US; they've hosted internationals in a variety of locations because the average arena size is about 17,000-18,000. They're all roughly the same. English football should start playing around the country again. There's been calls for that since the new Wembley's been built. They've started doing it with certain internationals. Wembley's in a horrific location in the sense that the transport links are there, but they're not great. The stadium is regularly criticised by fans for the atmosphere, the seating, the way it's designed, how far you're away from the pitch and everything. I think the old Wembley, while it was an old stadium and definitely needed to be refurbed and rebuilt, the current design is not what it should be. It's not a great stadium. It's a big stadium, but you notice if you it's not just football. It's a variety of sports that have had games there. There's a lot of empty seats. Challenge Cup in Rugby League is a prime example of fans losing love and falling out of love with the stadium. And yes, they have used Old Trafford. They have used St James's Park. They have used Spurs. I think they've used St Mary's. They've used Stadium of Light. When the stadium was being rebuilt in the 2000s, they did take internationals around the country to great success and great sellouts. And while the team didn't perform at tournament level, it did perform in the qualifiers. It did do well. And you could say fans really felt a connection with the team. Since it's been back at Wembley, the 13 years it's been back, yes, the team on the field has improved. But do fans feel a connection? There's a lot of complaints about Club Wembley. There's a lot of complaint about ticket price. We will have to see what happens going forward. The debate about Wembley rages on. You know, the FA did try and sell it a couple of years ago. That didn't go down well. So the debate about the use of Wembley is there. Rugby League is, again, they've hosted internationals at a variety of locations. When the Kiwis played their three game series tour here, they used Hull, they used Liverpool, they used Leeds. So they took that on the road around the north of England, and again, a lot of empty seats. So I think you've got to look at do you need a national stadium, or should you just take it on the road? Other nations, do take internationals on the road to great success. But it's an interesting question. Should the national side in football take it on tour? But England, when it comes to Rugby Union with Twickenham, regularly sell out that stadium. Good atmospheres. I like going to Twickenham. I think it's a very, very good facility. Rugby League could do more to expand outside of the M62, and that's been regularly thrown at them, that they're not, looking at new money and new investment, and they're basically hamstringing the game to a very limited fan base and a very regional fan base. We know that the London Broncos have been a pretty solid side since they were in the Super League. Admittedly, they've spent a few seasons now in the Championship, but they're a pretty solid side. But they've never really had an established home stadium. They've been basically in exile around the London area for 20, 30 years, which is a problem in growing a fan base. Is you've got to have roots. And unfortunately, with Rugby League, that it is very north-centric, and it is, very protectionist. It doesn't seem to want to expand into the south of England. Scotland, Wales has been a disaster. So you could look at that and argue that, Rugby League could do better. But they have used Wembley before. They have used other big stadiums before. The Challenge Cup final takes place at Wembley every year, and then you have the Super League Grand Final takes place at Old Trafford every year. There's a debate about moving the Grand Final of the Challenge Cup away from Wembley, but they've got a long-term lease for another 5-6 years. So that in itself creates logistical and legal minefield of its own, which the RFL doesn't have the money to fight. It really doesn't. And fans are, very critical of again, getting fans to Wembley. It's a traditional home of the Challenge Cup final, but that's the problem with Rugby League. It's too stuck with tradition and not enough with modernisation. And I think that's where that sport struggles. On a global sporting standpoint, the NRL would wants to restart at the end of May, so about a month's time. And the AFL have said they're going to be playing games behind closed doors, and they're going to be pumping crowd noise in to create atmosphere, which I think is wrong. But what we're going to most likely see is definitely a shortened pre-season between the end of this season and next football season. And I think ice hockey is probably the sport that's least affected by this lockdown. I think when we come out of the lockdown, ice hockey will just go into its pre-season and then start playing again as normal. Whether they're allowed to play in front of fans or not, that's up to the medical experts. But I think we may see face masks in public as a compulsory thing. Whether that affects players having to wear full face shields, we'll wait and see. But that's an interesting point. But looking at overseas and how leagues are putting in contingency planning, the NHL and NBA, they've asked for arena availability up to August. And that is an interesting point, is that they're looking far ahead and they're regularly having meetings with the various local and state and regional government officials and national governments about getting the major leagues in the US and Canada restarted. That's going to be interesting. But it's an interesting one. I think we're going to have to, the sport is going to have to change. How was milk discovered? Oh my God. Milk was, oh, go away. It's not even important. But on a sporting standpoint, I think sports finance is going to change. Sports governance is going to have to change. We know that World Rugby, they're having an election, and it's an interesting one. You got Bill Beaumont on one side, and then you have Steve on the other. And it's interesting because Bill Beaumont's been in charge of World Rugby for quite some time. Augustin Pichot, he came up with the idea of revamping rugby before the Japanese World Cup, and his plans failed. But he has admitted that the financial structures have changed, the governance has to change, and the structures have to change. He's also said that top end tier talent, top end players are going to have to take pay reductions in order for professionalism across the board to work. Bill Beaumont's now thinking about changing eligibility rules for international selection. So that's going to be interesting to see who wins on that one. Should the Rugby League build an international stadium in the north? Doesn't have the money. The RFL does not have the money to do that, and that's the problem. It just doesn't have the cash. It's losing money, and most clubs are struggling to survive. So I can't see that one working at all. But when you have Rugby League internationals, they take it on the road. I think that's how they've done it for a long time. Occasionally they play at Wembley, but for the most part, when there's international matches, they take it on the road, and then more fans, I think, get to see the best players in the world play each other. But we've got the World Cup next year, so that's going to be interesting. That we've got the Rugby League World Cup in England. So, and looking at the list of stadiums, they put Wembley on there. There's a lot of stadiums that they put down. They put training facilities across the country down. So they're trying to build that up. Now, what will be interesting to see is how much marketing they put in, and how many games are accessible on free-to-air TV, and how many games will be on subscription only. But 2021, that's coming. But the big thing is World Rugby election. Bill Beaumont versus Augustin Pichot. You know, that's going to be the interesting battle there. Rugby League, it's in a mess. It's been in a mess financially for a long time. You know, there's not a lot of money in the game. Players aren't paid as well as people think. And you know, it's a sport that at its peak was you know, packing out stadiums and was watched by millions and millions of people. It's sort of lost its way, and there's a variety of issues at play. But the RFL needs to modernise. It's stuck in the past. You could say it's the poor relation because of the geographic location it's played in, and there's less money in the north of England. There's less economic development. It's not as wealthy. The areas that it plays in, unemployment's generally higher, wages are generally lower. So the average fan has got less money to spend on tickets, merchandise. Very few games are on free-to-air TV, so it's less accessible for fans than it used to be. And all in all, there are issues with facilities. There are issues with talent. The NRL is the better competition. By some margin, the NRL is the better competition. There's no doubt on that. That's why some of the best British-based players or British eligible players who can play for the home nations are playing in the NRL. We are starting to see some pretty good NRL players who played over there. Are still reasonably young coming over here to play. So we are seeing a slight shift, but at the same time, I can't really see rugby league as it currently stands making as much inroads into the national sporting psyche as it could. I think the RFL needs drastic reform. Otherwise, it's going to become more of an irrelevance. And rugby union's in its own mess as well. Rugby union, the Saracens mess, the issues with club finances in Welsh and Scottish rugby being well highlighted. You've got calls to ring fence the Premiership, which I think are wrong, but finances below the Premiership are a mess. Rugby union's not in the best of health either. It's not as healthy as it would like us to believe. There are issues with rugby finances, and this is why the debate between Augustin Pichot's plans and Bill Beaumont's plans for the future of the game are highly important, and the direction the sport takes. I prefer watching rugby league for club level rugby. I prefer watching rugby union for international level rugby. It's a toss up because rugby league I find a much easier watch and an easier game to understand and get into the sport. Rugby union, I find internationally it's a better watch than at club level because you're seeing the best of each nation going against each other. But either way, I think it's each their own. I prefer both. I like both codes. So I'm not going to say which code's better because I think for a newbie to the game, rugby league is I think the one to get you in, and then rugby union is for the hardcore. I think for those new fans. But I can watch both codes in a day. I can watch a rugby league NRL game and then put on a rugby union match and be quite happy to watch the Super League or NRL game and then change. Watch that and then watch some Major League Rugby in the US, for example, on the same day. I could watch like 5 matches a day, and 2 of them could be league, and 3 of them could be union, or vice versa. I have no real preference, except when it comes to club level, I prefer rugby league, and national level, international level, I prefer rugby union. I just there's something about rugby union at international level where I think it's better officiated, more players play it, and. It's just a personal preference. It's so hard to just say I prefer this code over that code. But I think both codes definitely need structural reform and governance. That's something that has been highlighted regularly in recent years. Is the governance side of both codes? They're basically separate sports at this point, but that's been regularly highlighted. The fact that rugby league doesn't have a universal rulebook. The NRL has a different rule book to the Super League when it comes to refereeing and how we play the ball and the tackle area. International rules are different again. Would it be conceivable for the 2 codes to merge? No, there's a reason why they split in the first place. I think you could have dual code clubs where you have a league and a union club working side by side, but I can't see the codes merging together just become rugby. There's a reason why they split in 1868. That split is historical. The 2 codes have evolved very, very differently. Obviously, the same basic skill principles apply with pass the ball backwards, kick forwards, possession, tackle area. The same basic skill set is required to play both. but I can't see either code wanting to merge with the other. I think on a financial standpoint, it would make a lot of logical sense to have dual code clubs where in the summer you have league and in the autumn and winter you have union. I think that is highly feasible. It's a great way to grow both codes in non-traditional markets and financially prop up, because then you've got a year-wide fan base. And uh, both codes have financial issues. You could look at the TV deals that are in place that aren't very popular with fans. You could look at the poor structures in place. You could definitely look at the governance issues that both codes are facing, and you could argue that you need a revamp at the top. There's not enough ex-players involved in developing the sports rulebook, developing, leading in governance side of things, and it's an interesting one. What's been highlighted in recent years is definite governance failings and financial problems across the board. Across the board, I think what we're going to see out of this is a definite call for change. How much change you put in and how you go about, reforming is beyond my expertise. I'm a fan looking in, but the issues with revenue sharing between tier 1 and tier 2 nations, the issue with player development and youth development, there are clear problems in place that are there and have been there for a long time, and professionalism rugby union hasn't worked as it should have. And you look at rugby league. I mean, it's the selection rules for international level. You can play for about 10 different countries, it seems. And again, the problem is the sport isn't being allowed to grow, and they're not looking at new locations enough. And when they do expand, like the Super League has with Toronto, they're putting so many hurdles in the way for that club to function. It puts them at a disadvantage going forward. So you're not going to have healthy growth in a new market where you have an untapped fan base that likes contact sports in Canada and the US. You're hamstringing efforts to grow the sport. It's semi-pro in the US and Canada outside of the Toronto Wolfpack. There's clearly an interest from Americans in both codes and Canadians. You just have to look at Major League Rugby, the Rugby Union equivalent, and you can see there's definitely a growing fan interest. It's how they definitely need to look at governance and the financial makeup and the structures in place, because clubs are losing money, and some clubs are working and budgeting beyond their means, and that's in both codes. It doesn't matter if it doesn't matter if they combine or not and remerge. Do I think lacrosse will be played in Europe? It is played in Europe, not to the same level or same standard as in North America, but lacrosse is played in Europe to a certain degree in certain schools and universities. But it's such a niche sport in over in Europe that it doesn't really have the fan base, so to speak. The closest you'll get to lacrosse in Europe is hurling in the Gaelic Amateur Association in Ireland. And that's the closest you'll get. It's an interesting one. Lacrosse is played in Europe, but not to any professional standard, I don't think. I've never come across a professional league. I know it exists. Lacrosse is a European sport. It's played at amateur level in universities. It's not really a professional sport, and it was played at my school, so I have seen lacrosse played, but it's not really a professional sport. And much like some other niche sports, it doesn't get the coverage it possibly should. But even in North America, it's not seen as the top level of pro sport, because you've already got the 4 major leagues, and the closest you'll get to lacrosse is ice hockey, and ice hockey is already more established in Europe and in North America. There's more people playing it. It's far better funded. Lacrosse, it's more of a collegiate sport in North America. It is played. There is a professional lacrosse league, but it's very niche, and you don't earn a lot of money playing it compared to the other major league sports in the US and Canada. So already that's putting a hurdle in the way is the money side of things. But it is played. It's a fun sport to watch. It is played. It's just not as popular as other sports. It's a very niche sport. It's seen as an upper class sport as well, lacrosse. But it is a fun watch. But again, it's a niche sport, and you've got to market things in the right way, and that's where you then have the issues. Like, okay, is there a fan base for it? Is there a market to tap into? But it's a thing. The US and the Canadians, they sort of have done that in the past with ice hockey, with the NHL and the US and Canada. They have got a rivalry there. You look at the 2010 Olympics in Vancouver, the final, the gold medal game. World Junior Championships, there's a rivalry between the US and Canada. Same at the World Championships, the rivalry is there. To do a separate series, that's up for is an interesting discussion point. You know, should they have a 3-match series or something? They've done it in the past as one-offs, as a regular thing. That's up to the players, because there's other international nations that will definitely challenge the US and the Canadians. You've got the Finns, you've got the Swedes, you've got the Swiss have got quite a good side. The Germans have got a pretty solid international setup at the moment. The Russians, obviously. So, you know, they've tried a World Cup a couple of times. That hasn't really worked in the current format or the previous format. So they've had, like, if they could have a World Cup of hockey, not just the World Championships every year, but a World Cup, that might be interesting to see how that would be formatted. But again, it's the time of year they would have to play it and release. There's already a debate about the NHL players playing at the Olympics. So, you know, you've got to factor in logistics there and the regular seasons across Europe and North America, and releasing players to play. And when you have the World Championships, they take place at the same time as Stanley Cup, and that's where the Canadians and the US don't have necessarily their best players available, because they're playing in the Stanley Cup playoffs, and yet the Europeans, apart from their NHL players, they can call upon their players who play in other leagues, and so they can still put pretty strong teams out. And so the World Championships, the US and the Canadian fan base don't take it as seriously, and they're not as successful. That's why the Russians and the Europeans are pretty good when it comes to the World Championships. You just look at the World Championship golds and where they go. It's very rare that the Canadians and the Americans do well in recent years, because of the time of year it's played, because the Stanley Cup playoffs are taking place at the same time. Interesting question, though. Do you think the US and Canada? Yeah, Canada and the USA, they've done it in the past. There is a rivalry there. They've done it in Rugby Union as well, where both teams really don't like each other very much. Could we see a similar? It's possible. The Canadians will be in for a very rude shock. The US have massively improved player development and player depth. There's a lot more Americans playing in the NHL now than there were 20 years ago. I think the Canadians will be in for a massive shock if they were to decide to do, let's say, a 3 or 5 game series, for example, or a 7 game series. They would be in for a fair shock. You have to think there's only the habitable belt, as they call it, the where most of the cities are within 100 miles. I think 80% of Canada's population lives in the border zone, within 60 or 80 miles of the border or something. So most Canadians live within a 3-hour drive of the US anyway. It's because, it's great geographical size, but a lot of it is wilderness, and you just cannot farm that land. You cannot live there comfortably, because it gets very cold in Canada. Yeah, it can. But I think the lowest, a couple of years ago in Winnipeg and Manitoba, it hit like minus 56 Celsius. That's not great for living in, really. And when it's that cold for lengthy periods, that's a health hazard. So it's not the most habitable place at times. Apart from the coastal areas, it's not necessarily the most habitable place. There are vast parts that you won't see people for like 2,000 miles. You could drive for 2, 3, 4 days and not see a single person, but a fair bit of wildlife. You won't. You'll just go through pine forests. Oh yeah, the Aussies are the same. Very similar to Canada. Very big landmass. Very limited habitable area in the sense because the centre of the country is a desert and gets to 40, 50 degrees Celsius plus. Alice Springs is very strange. It's one of the biggest inland settlements in Australia, and again, look at the size of it. It's not a massive city. 85% of Australians live on cities on the coast. When you go inland, I think the biggest city inland, like I think 300,000 people. It's not. It's where most of the agricultural land is, and after that you are in the interior, and the interior is not very habitable at all. Once you get up, we're 100 miles from the coast. It's nearly you might as well die because it's uninhabitable. And when you talk about like success as a sporting nation, Australia and Canada are very very successful sporting nations because 70 or 80% of the population have played semi-professional sport at some point in their life. The Canadians, 70% of Canadians have played ice hockey at some level. Australians, 70 or 80% have played one of the three major sports, be it cricket, Aussie rules, or rugby league, at some point in their life. There's a very good amateur sporting culture in those countries. Yeah, a lot of people in America think we all live in London and that we all talk like Mary Poppins and we're all posh, or we all talk like Dick Van Dyke and Mary Poppins. They can't deal with some of our accents. When they come over here, they when they go to places like Manchester or Liverpool or Newcastle or Birmingham or the West Country or even parts of the southeast, they're really surprised by the accents, the slang, and how we're all not talking Queen's English. It does surprise them that we have a population size that we do on such a small landmass, but we're a very urban society here, and that generally surprises them, and it also surprises them, how mad we are for our sport as well. Um, Generally surprises them. They think the only clubs are in the football clubs are in the Premier League. They forget that you got Championship, League One, and League Two, and the non-league, and that there's I forget how many clubs are FA affiliated, but there's a lot. Um, they a lot of North Americans are really surprised that we have a professional ice hockey league in this country. They just absolutely stunned when you look at the history of some of them. You can find. I mean, within 5 minutes of my house, you're in the countryside, but then within 8 miles, you're in another big urban area. So um, I've just gone for a walk, but it's interesting because I live within 20 odd miles of London. Um, Within a 5 minute walk of my house, I'm in fields. They're being built on, but eventually a lot of those fields that I've, you know, run around in as a kid and had a kick about in down the park, they are going to disappear. I've gone mountain biking in the woods. They are slowly being built on. So unfortunately, where I live is expanding rapidly as a town, and a lot of the rural areas are slowly disappearing. The green belt is disappearing and has done over the last decade or so. I've noticed a lot of changes, and more of the farmland and the woodland and the heathland is disappearing onto housing estates and industrial estates. It's worrying that from Reading to Basildon is basically just an urban blob. And I'm Bracknell, so I'm 10 miles east of Reading or so. It's becoming an urban blob. From Tilehurst through to Basildon and Essex is just constant urbanisation. It's the same in Surrey from and Farnborough and Aldershot in Hampshire all the way through Woking and Guildford into southwest London. It's just an urban corridor. It's a blob, and it's disappearing. But there's a lot of sports teams in these locations, and the Americans don't realise that we have sports teams in these locations that play a pretty decent standard and level of rugby and football and cricket and ice hockey, and they come over here and they're really stunned that we have that many sports teams all on top of each other. No, the ice hockey is just because the conditions you could play outside. They took to it quite quickly. It was really promoted by the governor, Lord Stanley Cup, and his daughter really promoted it in the late 1890s. They really promoted it because they played it in Scotland. They did really promote it. They were big patrons of it, and the Canadian people, at the time, winter over there really shuts the country down. And the fact they could play that sport in winter meant that people could get outside, they could do stuff, they could still be active when other parts of let's say, the US are in lockdown. And Canada, they really took to it in Ontario and Quebec. They really bought into it, and then they spread it across the rest of the Dominion, which was Canada at the time, the Dominion of Canada. And they took to it like a duck to water, because it gave them something to do in winter when they couldn't really do much. So it became very popular, and then it became professional, and then they got really, really good at it. But then the Europeans enjoyed it as well. It's just how it happened. It was patronised by the governor at the time, and a lot of teams were set up. A lot of British went over there who did play it, and it grew from there. And the Canadians really took to it because in winter there's not a lot to do on a social standpoint. It does get very cold and very dark, and to be able to play it outside initially, and then they worked out refrigeration techniques to actually build in indoor ice surfaces and indoor arenas. It went from there. Oh yeah, Japan actually took to baseball before World War II. They found it very, very popular from their trading. Actually, Japan really took baseball to heart. So did the Philippines. They're really got big baseball leagues. Football and rugby and all that, and cricket, British Empire, and industrialists. They took the sport with them. Then you've got other sports that have developed, and most of them come from Europe and then expand. Lacrosse, yeah, is sort of derived from hurling. So you could look at a lot of the Irish immigrants to the US and Canada, and then it evolved out of that. Ice hockey is similar to shinty, which again evolved in Scotland. So you could look at the old European sports and how they spread around the world, and it's an interesting one. And you look at it and how certain countries have really taken to a particular sport and made it their national sport, where they put a lot of financial investment into it. They put a lot of promotions into it. It's like Rugby Union has become Georgia's national sport when wrestling was the national sport beforehand until the mid-90s, and now it's become the national sport. You look at the Irish sports. There's a division between the Gaelic Amateur Association and the professional sports, because professional sports are seen as garrison sports, which are seen as British occupation sports. It's a long political thing, and there's a reason why the Gaelic Amateur Association is still amateur sport. They refuse to go professional, even though there are calls from some players and fans to make it more professional so that the athletes can actually earn a living out of it. Very interesting divide there. It's a social thing as well. Cycling, the French have turned that into a thing, and actually bicycles are more of a French thing than a British thing, ironically. The Tour de France, and then you've got the Vuelta in Spain and the Giro. Cycling was made very popular by the French. The French made cycling very, very popular. The velodrome is a French word. The first velodromes were actually in France. So Britain didn't invent all the sports in the world and define them. You look at all the associations when it comes to sports governance. A lot of them have French origins when it comes to FIFA, UEFA, the IOC. They were French ideas. So the modern Olympics is a French idea. It's not a British idea. The modern Olympics is a French idea, and that's why when you have the governing bodies, you'll have FIFA, and then you'll have the French translation underneath. The French really drove sports governance internationally, whereas the British invented a lot of sports. The French came up with the rules for them. Ironically, it's very interesting to look at how sports originated and why certain nations have gone for certain sports, and why basketball invented by a Canadian. There you go. Basketball was invented by a Canadian and sold to the US, and it was only sold to the US because the NHL owners wanted to fill their arenas with another sport to make them more money. The NBA would not exist without the NHL. That's something else. Um, how popular do you think football would be if European imperialism didn't exist? I think that is an open-ended question. Hindsight's interesting. I don't think you could predict how a sport would evolve. You just cannot predict that. That is an interesting one. Very, very interesting. How sport would evolve if European imperialism or the old world expanding to the new world and immigration didn't exist, and we didn't go over to North America and South America. That is an interesting point. Very interesting point. The answer is we don't know. History tells us that football originated in the UK. The Europeans picked up through trading and stuff like that. And British industrialists went round and set up football clubs around Europe, and then locals played it, and then they set their own clubs, and then a lot of them emigrated to the New World in the late 1880s, early 1900s, and then took the sport with them. Then South Americans really, like the Brazilians, the Argentinians, the Uruguayans, got very, very good at it. And they hosted a World Cup in Uruguay with no European nations, ironically, and Uruguay won. Then Italy won 2 World Cups and the war came. It's very interesting, the history of football across Europe and how then it's spread across the world. Very, very interesting. I tried to do a video on Eintracht Frankfurt earlier, and then the upload wouldn't work. So, I mean, Eintracht Frankfurt, a German club, founded in 1899. So, very quickly, football spread very, very quickly across Europe. And then once it spread across Europe, it then went across the world. And certain nations decided to put a lot of emphasis on professional sports. And the Soviet Union and the Soviet nations put a lot of funding, state funding, into sports programs for the Olympics, and use that as a political statement. Hence why the Red Army ice hockey team was so good. They were soldiers. They were basically professionals when everyone else was amateurs playing at the Olympics. So that's an interesting one. If I think, I don't know. I think with how things have gone, I think a sport would have become popular somewhere globally. A sport would have become popular globally. It just so happens that football, soccer, if you live in North America or Australia, is the most popular global sport. But I think it's because it's easy to play. You need just 2 groups of 11 people and a ball, and a playing area where you can mark out, a pitch. You just need 22 people and a ball and a guy to run the game, and 2 other officials. You need 3 officials, a ball, and 22 people to play. That is how cheap it is. Whereas other sports like ice hockey, like American football, like rugby, you need a lot more people to play. You need, specific surfaces to play on, which require people to set them up. That's why football became the most popular sport, is because it was the cheap, the affordability of it, to play it, and the accessibility to play it. You didn't have to be a wealthy person to play. You didn't have to be a certain physical stature to play it. You could be quite small and low to the ground and still be very, very good at it. Maradona, for example, wasn't the tallest player. Lionel Messi, he's not very tall. He's very low to the ground, low center of gravity, and quite quick with his feet. But you don't have to be a hulking beast, whereas in rugby, you sort of have some physicality to play the game. It's an interesting one. Cricket's another one as well, which for European sport hasn't had the same reach globally as other sports. Rugby Union, Rugby League, and football have a far bigger global reach than cricket, which is really surprising considering it's a European sport that was taken around the world. It's growing, but it's surprising that it didn't have the reach that other sports did. But cricket's going to have to change how it governs itself and finances as well. Cricket's in real financial trouble, and yeah, basketball invented by a Canadian, brought to the US. Interesting topic there. Basketball is an interesting one. It's a very, very popular sport in the. It's another interesting one. I didn't enjoy playing it. It's interesting to note why it's mostly popular with the African American community. That's an interesting point. It's an interesting point that it's more popular with the African American community than other sports. Again, because it's cheap and affordable. and the African American community is generally economically not as well as off as other immigrant groups and European groups who go over to the US. But it is interesting that it is really popular because it's easy to play. You need, you know, a basketball. Reality, you don't need that much equipment to play it, and not as many people to play it either. Um, Again, it's a cost thing. It's very cheap to get into. It's not as expensive to to play and to train and to play at amateur level. It's more accessible for every strata of society. Much like football, you can just grab a ball and play. Um, but it's an interesting one why it's not more popular in Europe. It's very popular in Eastern and Central Europe because of the government schemes during the Cold War to pump money into these sports for um, Olympic purposes. That's an interesting one. There's a lot of government funding that went in Eastern Europe, so it's very popular across Europe. Um, why is it not more popular in the UK and Ireland? Other sports have already got that niche. I wouldn't say it's just a PE sport. There is a basketball league. It's a very niche sport which only really appeals to a very niche socio-economic group in this country. Really, yes, the NBA does take games to the O2. Yes, there is a fan base here, but other other sports have filled the gap where basketball didn't grow, and it's partly to do with promotion, and it's partly to do with the fact that football and the working class rugby league had already nailed down the working class fan base and players, and rugby union and cricket had nailed down the middle and upper class players and fan base, and then ice hockey was sort of another sport underneath that. We had a pretty good league in the 50s, so you already had the team sports nailed down, the social economic groups and playing player base and fan base pretty quickly. And when basketball came along, it already had a battle to fight with the established European sports already here. And the funding in this country is a joke anyway. Yes, it's played at some schools, not all. The funding isn't great. You could argue that the Olympics, they should have kept that funding in place with the success of the 2012 Olympics. They didn't. They actually cut basketball funding, which is a problem. It's one of those sports that has a tough battle ahead of it to break into the established sports here. But we are going to see a change in sport post this crisis. Sport is going to have to change. There's going to be less money available, and they're going to have to look at cutting costs. So it may sneak in. It might get some growth there, but in the good times, it wasn't really played. It didn't have the growth it should have in the good times. So in the bad times, it's going to be interesting to see what actually happens going forward on a social level. It's going to be interesting to see going forward. Can it grow its fan base? Can it grow its participation? Can it be made more accessible to a wider player pool? And can more teams be set up on an amateur level? Because football is the national obsession in this country, and then the other sports play second fiddle to that. What it needs is a big superstar playing in the NBA, and a big superstar who wins the playoffs and wins a title in the NBA, be it individual player title for most valuable player or most points in the season. That's what it really needs, is some kind of spark to then go, right, okay, this is an inspiration for not just Afro-Caribbean kids, but kids of all backgrounds and all socio-economic backgrounds to want to play. That's the interesting point. That's the point. If they can get one or two or maybe a handful of players, being able to reach the top echelons of the sport in the US and Canada and actually win, that makes it interesting. This is where I think ice hockey, as a global sport, is probably growing better. It could do better with it, advertising itself and TV deals. But ice hockey, the amount of European players now playing in North America is at, I think, 40% of the player base is now European. But again, you've got to have the willingness from athletes to want to take up the sport, and you've got to have the youth programs and the funding in place for amateur and youth level there, and it's just not there because most schools will play football, they'll play either code of rugby, they'll play cricket. Universities, again, rugby, football, cricket, bit of ice hockey. There's a university league. It falls down lower for youth funding, be it through professional clubs and youth programs, and then state funding in state funded PE lessons at school. It doesn't get the funding. So funding is an issue. You've got to have the grassroots to then build up a professional league and a sustainable league and a sustainable player base and a sustainable fan base. That's the problem. And there's not many arenas where you can really play basketball in this country that, of a decent size where you can get a decent amount of fans in and decent quality facilities. That's another thing. You've got to have the facilities as well as the funding for grassroots. You've got to have the facilities. If you have neither, or you only have one, you need both. And most sports funding, most kids want to play football. Most kids want to play rugby. Ice hockey, I've seen a massive growth in that at youth level. There's now more players than they can have teams for. So youth level ice hockey in this country is growing rapidly. I've seen it in the last couple of years. But you look at basketball. I just don't know how many youth teams there are and how many adult amateur teams there are to then go, right, there is a player base where we can go, okay, we can have a professional league that's decent. I think, yeah, you could argue it doesn't suit the British psyche, but there isn't the money there. There isn't enough interest there to pump the private sector money in. You need the state to step up and provide facilities for kids, youth centres, youth sports halls or sports facilities where, the facilities are, the money is pumped in. But a lot of kids lose interest. I never got into it. I'm not a massive fan of basketball, not because it's a bad sport. It's just something that doesn't appeal to me. And growing up, there were sports that appealed to me more and that I found more accessible through the media or through actually playing and watching in person, that I found more accessible. I think it's to do with the 2012 Olympics and how they cut it, considering that we had to have a team, and the team wasn't very good anyway. But that's the problem, is British players are going to have to look and go, right, do I have to get a university scholarship in the US to get anywhere? And that costs money. University education costs money. But then you could look at universities and go, right, we could really improve basketball facilities. We could do something. But it doesn't help with the timings either. It does not help. It's the same with the NHL, though. They're on it late at night. It doesn't help with that. But I think what you do need is to have a couple of British players get drafted by the NBA and have decent NBA careers, and then you need to have one or two of them to then go on to have success in the NBA to then grow the British fan base. And they need to make a big thing about, I'm British, by the way. We don't have enough of them. We just don't have enough of them. But when Piers Morgan is actually, I'm agreeing with Piers Morgan, that's worrying because I can't stand him. But no, he is correct that he did. I do remember him in 2012 mentioning the lack of funding and mentioning the fact that the funding cuts were happening because we just had a domestic Olympics that was one of the most successful Olympics of all time. And the Olympic legacy seems to have not really followed through in the last 8 years, which I think is a shame because I really enjoyed the London Olympics. It was a shot in the arm I think the country needed at the time, and it was one of the best Olympics I've ever watched. The TV audience was massive. The uptake and participation of sports in the following years was massive, yet they cut funding for a lot of them, which I find absolutely illogical, personally. Not just basketball, across the board, sports funding through the British Olympic Association, there are questions being raised about, yes, we've been very successful as an Olympic nation over the last 20 years. The amount of medals we've won, I think, with the third or fourth out of all the nations. But again, you have to look at the funding matrix and how they work it out and why, with the uptake and people wanting to, get involved in sport, why funding was cut. How did the GB do in the Olympic ice hockey? We failed to qualify for this coming Olympics, but we are in the World Championship Group 1, which is the top tier. We have some history in the Olympics, but unfortunately, again, post World War II, it's again, it's to do with funding and it's to do with facilities and players and player base. It is growing. I can definitely see British ice hockey improving massively in the coming years. We now are having players drafted by the NHL, so the change is there. It's whether it's sustainable long term, and finances are a big concern. But the amount of kids and adults socially playing it is going up. So the numbers of people wanting to play the sport is going up. But again, funding is an issue. Funding is a problem. But we have far more homegrown talent now playing than we did before. The participation of kids is up, but it's an expensive sport to get into. So you need to have a bit of money to pay for your kids' kit and stuff. So long term, this is a worrying thing that's happening right now with the shutdown economically. Will that affect things? Possibly. But in the preceding 5-6 years, we've seen massive growth in the sport in this country. Massive. So we'll see what happens going forward. We will see what happens, but the sport is growing and getting more media attention, getting more sponsorship, more money's coming in. But long term, we have to look at the future of the sport long term, and whether the wealthier leagues could do something to support the less wealthier leagues to keep player development and the game going global and growing the game. Anyway, I'm going to leave that there because I've got to do some other bits and pieces. Thank you very much for all your questions. A lot of debating points. Started off talking about football, we finished on ice hockey. That's an interesting one. Quickly round up. Yeah, we're looking at playing club games behind closed doors when it comes to football. We're looking at UEFA trying to get the Champions League completed in August. Europa League is a question mark. Next season is probably going to have no winter break, shorter transfer window, shorter pre-season, and then we're going into the Euros, and that could be very, very interesting how the Euros get played out next summer. I think we could have one of the best tournaments we've possibly ever seen. I think fans just want sport back. Now, whether we'll be allowed to go into stadiums and pack up stadiums again this year or next year, we'll have to wait and see. But it's going to be interesting to see what happens coming out of the lockdown. And I think sport, especially sports like football, that are in a battle between the players and the teams about finances, how they go forward. But we're going to have to see some massive changes. We might see salary caps. We may see transfer, caps, spending caps of some kind. And that may be a permanent thing. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. Thanks for all your questions. And I'll have some more videos for you very, very soon. All right. Now